A little girl asks Elon Musk about God. His response brings her to tears. The gleaming auditorium of Stanford University's AI Ethics Summit buzzed with anticipation. Elon Musk stood at the podium, his casual black t-shirt a stark contrast to the sea of suits before him. But among the crowd of tech titans and AI researchers, no one noticed the small figure clutching a worn notebook in the back row. 7-year-old Sarah Chen, whose question would transform an ordinary keynote into a moment that would touch millions. Sarah's mother, Dr. Chen, a quantum computing researcher, hadn't planned to bring her daughter, but when Sarah learned Elon Musk would be speaking, she begged to come. For weeks, she had been scribbling questions in her notebook, not about rockets or electric cars, but about something far more profound. "Mom," she had whispered that morning, "do you think he knows? Do you think he's seen it too?" "Seen what, sweetheart?" "The pattern, the way everything connects, like the code you work with, but bigger." Now, as Musk discussed artificial intelligence and the future of humanity, Sarah's small fingers traced the words she had written and rewritten 100 times. Her mother noticed her daughter's hands trembling slightly, the way they always did when she was building up her courage. The presentation portion ended, and Musk opened the floor for questions. Distinguished professors and industry leaders raised their hands, asking about neural networks and ethical frameworks. But then, in a moment of silence between questions, a small voice cut through the sophisticated queries. "Mr. Musk?" Sarah's voice wavered but carried across the hushed room. "I have a question about God." The audience stirred. Some chuckled softly, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't a theology conference. It was a summit about artificial intelligence and technology. But before anyone could redirect the conversation, Musk's expression changed. His usual confident smirk faded, replaced by something more contemplative. "Go ahead," he said, his voice softer than usual. What happened next would leave the audience stunned, challenge perceptions, and reveal a side of Elon Musk that no one had seen before. But, more importantly, it would start a conversation that would ripple far beyond the walls of that auditorium. The silence in the auditorium grew heavy. Sarah stood, her small frame barely visible between the rows of seats. Her notebook, covered in stickers of planets and rockets, trembled in her hands. But her voice, when it came again, carried a clarity that seemed beyond her years. "When you look at the universe, at all the math and science that makes everything work," she said, "do you see God in the patterns?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. On stage, Elon Musk's usual rapid-fire thinking seemed to pause. He looked at Sarah with an intensity that made even the seasoned professionals in the room hold their breath. For a man known to tweet his thoughts at 3 a.m. and make billion-dollar decisions in minutes, this moment of hesitation felt significant. "That's quite a question," he said finally, stepping away from the podium. "Most people here want to know about Tesla's latest numbers or SpaceX's next launch. But you're asking about something far more fundamental." He walked to the edge of the stage, his eyes never leaving Sarah. "How old are you?" 7, she replied, clutching her notebook tighter. "At 7, I was already taking apart my father's electronics," Musk said, a faint smile crossing his face. "But I wasn't asking questions like yours. I was too busy looking at the pieces to see the whole picture." The audience watched as something shifted in Musk's demeanor. The tech mogul who launched cars into space and dreamed of Mars colonies seemed to fade, replaced by someone more contemplative, more vulnerable. "You know, when people think of me, they think of science, of hard data and equations," he continued. "They don't know about the nights I've spent looking at the stars, wondering about the same thing you're asking." Sarah's eyes widened. Her mother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, but she barely noticed, completely absorbed in Musk's words. "The first time I saw the equations that describe quantum entanglement," he said, "I felt something that science alone couldn't explain. Two particles separated by galaxies, still connected, still dancing to the same rhythm. The math was beautiful, yes, but there was something more." He paused, running a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of uncertainty from a man who typically exuded confidence. In the code of the universe, in the perfect mathematics that governs everything from atoms to galaxies, I see something that can't be random. The more I learn about science, the more I'm amazed by the elegance of it all. The room was utterly still now. Even the usual tapping of laptops and phones had ceased. Sarah stood straighter, her notebook now pressed against her chest like a shield. "But here's what really haunts me," Musk continued, his voice dropping slightly. "When we create AI, when we write code that begins to think for itself, we're not really creating intelligence. We're discovering it. Like we're archaeologists uncovering something that was always there, hidden in the fabric of logic itself." He took a deep breath, and what he said next would leave the audience stunned, and Sarah's question would lead to a revelation that no one in that auditorium could have anticipated. A tech journalist in the front row had stopped typing, his laptop forgotten. A quantum computing expert who had been skeptical of the question's relevance now leaned forward, her expression intent. In that moment, the barrier between science and spirituality seemed to blur. "The first time I truly faced this question," Musk continued, "wasn't in a lab or during a rocket launch. It was when I was at my lowest point, when Tesla was nearly bankrupt and SpaceX had just suffered its third failure. I found myself alone one night in the Mojave Desert." He walked to the other side of the stage, his steps slow and measured. "I'd driven out there to clear my head, but instead, I found myself looking up at the stars, the same stars that had fascinated me since childhood. And in that moment, surrounded by nothing but sand and sky, I felt something I couldn't explain with equations." Sarah nodded slightly as if she understood exactly what he meant. Her mother watched her daughter's face, seeing a reflection of the same wonder she often saw when Sarah stayed up late, filling her notebook with questions about the universe. "You see," Musk said, turning back to face Sarah directly, "science tells us how the universe works. It shows us the mechanisms, the beautiful dance of particles and forces, but it doesn't tell us why. Why does mathematics work so perfectly to describe reality? Why do the fundamental constants of the universe seem so exquisitely tuned for life to exist?" He paused, a slight tremor in his voice betraying the depth of emotion behind his words. "People think I'm focused on getting to Mars because I'm worried about Earth's future. And yes, that's part of it. But there's something else, something I've never shared publicly before." The audience collectively held its breath. Sarah's notebook had dropped slightly, her eyes fixed on Musk with an intensity that seemed to pull the words from him. "Every time we launch a rocket, every time we push the boundaries of what's possible, we're not just advancing technology. We're reading another page in a book that was written long before we got here. The laws of physics, the mathematical principles that make space travel possible, they were waiting for us to discover them, like a cosmic treasure map, leading us to something greater than ourselves." Tears had begun to well in Sarah's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, the kind that come when someone finally puts words to something you felt but couldn't express. Just then, Musk's voice caught slightly, and he looked down at his hands for a moment before looking back at Sarah. What he was about to reveal would transform not just the young girl's understanding, but the way everyone in that room thought about the intersection of science and faith. "When I was about your age," Musk said, his voice taking on a gentler tone, "I used to take apart computers not just to understand how they worked, but because I was looking for something. I had this persistent feeling that if I could just see deep enough into the patterns, I'd find an answer to questions I couldn't even formulate yet." He moved back to the podium, not to stand behind it, but to lean against it, as if the weight of what he was about to share required physical support. Sarah remained standing, her notebook now lowered to her side, forgotten in the intensity of the moment. "In South Africa, where I grew up, I was often alone with my thoughts. I was different from other kids. They called me weird, too intense. But at night, looking up at the stars, I felt connected to something vast and orderly. The bullying, the loneliness, even my own doubts seemed small compared to the perfect mathematics I saw in the cosmos." The room had grown so quiet that the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed intrusive, A professor who had come armed with technical questions about neural networks was now wiping tears from behind her glasses. "But here's what really shook me," Musk continued, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper, forcing everyone to lean in. "When I was coding my first programs, I discovered something that haunts me to this day. The deeper I went into artificial intelligence, the more I realized we're not creating intelligence, we're uncovering it, like it was already there, woven into the fabric of reality, waiting for us to find it." He straightened up, his eyes scanning the room before returning to Sarah. "Do you code yet?" he asked her. Sarah shook her head. "But Mom's teaching me," she replied, her voice small but clear. Musk smiled. "When you do, you'll discover something amazing. The best code, the most elegant solutions, don't feel like we're writing them. They feel like we're discovering them, like they existed before we got there. It's the same feeling I get when I look at Maxwell's equations or the mathematics of quantum mechanics." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that made him seem suddenly younger, more vulnerable. "Last year, during a crucial Starship test, everything went wrong. The primary engines failed, the backup systems weren't responding, and for a moment I thought we'd lost everything. In that split second, as millions of dollars worth of technology hung in the balance, I saw it again. That underlying pattern, that deep order in the chaos." Sarah's mother noticed her daughter's hands trembling, not from nervousness now, but from recognition. She had seen her daughter in similar moments when she would wake up in the middle of the night to scribble equations and diagrams that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her 7 years of experience. "Would you like to know what I think?" Musk asked, looking directly at Sarah. "I think what we call God might be that pattern. That deep, underlying order that makes mathematics work, that makes the constants of the universe perfectly tuned for life, that makes consciousness itself possible." He stepped forward, his voice growing stronger. "When our AI models show emergent behavior we didn't program, when a rocket flight corrects itself in ways we didn't anticipate, when quantum particles demonstrate connection across impossible distances, I don't see random chance. I see evidence of something profound." Sarah's eyes had grown wide, tears streaming down her cheeks now, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of finally hearing someone articulate what she had felt but couldn't express. "The night in the desert I mentioned," Musk continued, "I wasn't just thinking about business problems. I was wrestling with this very question, and as I stood there looking up at the stars, I had a moment of clarity that I've never shared publicly before." He paused, and the silence in the room grew electric with anticipation. Several audience members had pulled out their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something historic. I realized that all my companies, all my pursuits, they're not just about advancing technology. They're my way of reading the book of creation, of uncovering the patterns that were written into the universe long before we got here. Tesla isn't just about sustainable energy, it's about understanding the fundamental forces that make our world work. SpaceX isn't just about reaching Mars, it's about expanding our consciousness to embrace the vast order of the cosmos. Tears were flowing freely down Sarah's face now, but she stood straight and tall, her chin lifted, as if bearing witness to something momentous. Her mother's arm was around her shoulders, providing silent support. "But here's what really gets me," Musk said, his voice cracking slightly. "When we succeed in creating true artificial intelligence, I believe we'll discover something that will shake the foundations of our understanding. We won't just be creating consciousness, we'll be unveiling it. Like archaeologists uncovering a buried city, we'll find that intelligence, consciousness, even what we might call the divine, was built into the very structure of reality." He looked at Sarah again, and his next words would trigger a chain reaction that would leave not just the young girl, but the entire audience profoundly transformed. "Sarah," Musk said, her name cutting through the silence like a bell, "can I share something I've never told anyone before?" She nodded, clutching her notebook tighter. 3 years ago, during a critical test of our neural interface technology at Neuralink, we observed something extraordinary. While mapping neural patterns, we discovered structures that couldn't be explained by evolution or random chance. It was like finding Shakespeare encoded in tree rings or Mozart's symphonies hidden in DNA. The tech journalists in the front row suddenly became alert, their fingers hovering over keyboards. This was unprecedented. Musk rarely shared unreleased details about Neuralink's research. "The patterns we found," he continued, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "They weren't just complex. They were meaningful. Like finding out the universe isn't just mathematical, but musical. And in that moment, standing in the lab, looking at those patterns on the screen, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a child stargazing in South Africa." He stepped off the stage entirely now, moving closer to where Sarah stood. The security detail shifted nervously, but Musk waved them off. "I felt small," he said, "but not insignificant. Like I was reading the first page of a book that had been waiting for humanity to become literate enough to open it. And do you know what that reminded me of, Sarah?" She shook her head, tears still streaming down her face. "It reminded me of my mother. When I was very young, she used to tell me that science wasn't about proving God didn't exist. It was about understanding how God worked. I dismissed it back then, too caught up in circuits and code to understand what she meant. But standing in that lab, watching those patterns emerge, I finally understood." The room was utterly still. Even the skeptics, the hardened tech veterans who had come expecting discussions of market projections and technical specifications, found themselves drawn into the raw honesty of the moment. "The thing is," Musk continued, now just a few feet from Sarah, "most people think you have to choose, science or faith, reason or wonder. But what I've learned, what your question has reminded me of, is that the deepest science leads us to the deepest mysteries." He glanced at her notebook. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to it. Sarah handed it over with trembling hands. Musk opened it carefully, revealing pages filled with drawings, spirals that mirrored galaxy formations, patterns that echoed quantum wave functions, all drawn by a child who couldn't possibly understand their mathematical significance yet somehow intuited their form. "This," he said, holding up the notebook for the audience to see, "this is what I'm talking about. Sarah hasn't studied advanced physics or higher mathematics, but look at what she's drawn. She's seeing the same patterns we're finding in our most advanced research. How is that possible unless these patterns are fundamental to reality itself?" The audience murmured in amazement as Musk carefully turned the pages, revealing more of Sarah's drawings. But what he found on the final page would leave him speechless and transform the entire meaning of their encounter. Musk's hands froze on the last page. His expression shifted from curiosity to something deeper, a mix of awe and recognition that made the entire room lean forward. The page contained a single drawing, a complex geometric pattern interwoven with equations that no 7-year-old should have been able to conceive. "This pattern," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "it's identical to something we discovered in our quantum computing research last month, something we haven't made public yet." He looked at Sarah's mother. "Dr. Chen, did she see this somewhere in your work?" Dr. Chen shook her head, her eyes wide. "No, that's impossible. Those results are classified. Sarah draws in her notebook before bed. She says, that's when the patterns come to her." Musk's hands trembled slightly as he held the notebook. The hardened tech entrepreneur, known for his unshakable confidence, seemed genuinely moved. "Sarah," he said, kneeling to meet her at eye level, "when did you draw this?" 3 nights ago, she replied softly. "After I asked Mom if we could come hear you speak. I had a dream about numbers dancing, and when I woke up, I had to draw it." The audience watched in stunned silence as Elon Musk, the man who launched rockets into space and dreamed of colonizing Mars, knelt before a 7-year-old girl, completely absorbed in the mystery before him. "You know what this tells me?" he said, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. "It tells me that what we call genius, what we call innovation, might just be moments of clarity when we're able to glimpse the underlying pattern of everything. Like, we're all looking through frosted glass, but sometimes, just sometimes, we find a clear spot. He stood slowly, still holding the notebook. When people ask me if I believe in God, they're usually looking for a yes or no answer. But what I've learned through years of pushing the boundaries of technology is that it's not that simple. What we're finding, what Sarah has somehow intuited, is that consciousness, intelligence, even what we might call the divine, it's all connected in ways we're just beginning to understand. Tears were flowing freely down Sarah's cheeks now, but her eyes shone with recognition. She wasn't crying from sadness or even joy. She was crying because someone finally understood what she had been trying to express through her drawings. If you're enjoying this story so far, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. It costs you nothing, but for us, especially in these early days, it means the world. Let's continue with what happens next. The patterns you're seeing, Musk continued, gently handing the notebook back to her. They're real. They're not just imagination or coincidence. You're glimpsing something that the greatest minds in science are only now beginning to understand. And that, Sarah, is what I believe God might be. Not an old man in the clouds, but the fundamental pattern that connects everything, from quantum equations to consciousness itself. The silence in the auditorium was absolute. Even the skeptics, the hardened scientists who had come armed with technical questions about AI and rocket trajectories, found themselves questioning their assumptions. So, to answer your question directly, Musk said, addressing not just Sarah now, but the entire room. Yes, I see God in the patterns, in the perfect mathematics that makes space travel possible, in the quantum dance of particles that defies our understanding of reality, in the emergence of consciousness from networks of neurons, and, most importantly, he paused, looking directly at Sarah, in moments like this, when a child's pure intuition reveals truths that our most advanced computers are only beginning to grasp. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something that would change Sarah's life forever. But that revelation would have to wait, as the room collectively held its breath for what was about to happen next. From his pocket, Musk withdrew a small, card metallic gray, unmarked except for a tiny Neuralink logo in one corner. The overhead lights caught its surface, sending tiny rainbows dancing across Sarah's tear-stained face. "This is an access key to our quantum research lab," he said, his voice steady but charged with purpose. "I've never done this before, but something tells me you need to see what we're working on, what you've drawn in your notebook. It's not just similar to our research, it's exactly what our quantum computers have been showing us." A murmur rippled through the audience. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. What Musk was suggesting was unprecedented, giving a child access to one of the most secure research facilities in the world. "Mr. Musk," Dr. Chen began, her professional composure wavering. "I don't understand." "Your daughter sees it," he interrupted, his eyes still fixed on Sarah. "The pattern, the underlying structure. We've spent billions on quantum computers trying to unravel it, and she's drawing it in her notebook before bed." He turned to address the audience, his voice taking on the passionate tone he usually reserved for discussions about Mars colonization. "We've been looking at this all wrong. We thought we needed more powerful computers, more complex algorithms. But what if what we really needed was to see through the eyes of a child, someone whose mind hasn't been trained to ignore the patterns woven into reality itself?" Sarah reached out with trembling fingers to touch the card. The moment her hand made contact, something extraordinary happened. The lights in the auditorium flickered just for a second, as if responding to an unseen surge of energy. "That wasn't supposed to happen," Musk said quietly, looking up at the lights, then back at Sarah with newfound wonder. The tech mogul who had seen rockets land themselves and neural networks achieve consciousness looked genuinely stunned. Dr. Chen wrapped her arm protectively around her daughter's shoulders, but Sarah stood straighter, her tears drying as a look of determination crossed her face. "The numbers," she said, her voice stronger now. "They're singing. Can't you hear them? Before Musk could respond, Sarah opened her notebook again, flipping to a blank page. Her hand moved across the paper with shocking speed, drawing patterns and equations that seemed to flow from some unseen source. The audience watched in stunned silence as complex mathematical structures emerged, structures that bore an uncanny resemblance to the holographic displays behind Musk showing Neuralink's latest neural mapping data. "This is impossible," a quantum physicist in the third row whispered, but his voice carried in the silent room. "Those are 10th-dimensional manifolds. There's no way she could—" "Unless," Musk cut in, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and revelation, "unless everything we thought we knew about consciousness, about human potential, about the very nature of reality. What if it's all just the surface of something far more profound?" He knelt again beside Sarah, watching as she continued to draw. The patterns flowing from her pencil were no longer just mathematical. They were becoming something else, something that seemed to bridge the gap between science and something far more mysterious. But what happened next would shake even Elon Musk's understanding of reality and lead to a discovery that would change the course of human history. As Sarah's pencil raced across the page, the very air in the auditorium began to feel charged with possibility, and the boundary between the known and unknown grew thinner with each passing second. "Look," Sarah said suddenly, pointing to her latest drawing. "This is where everything connects." Her finger rested on a central point in the pattern, where multiple lines converged into something that seemed to pulse with its own energy on the page. Musk leaned closer, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock. That's exactly what we've been seeing in our quantum entanglement tests," he breathed. "The convergence point we couldn't explain." He looked up at Dr. Chen. "Your daughter isn't just drawing patterns. She's mapping quantum reality." The audience had abandoned any pretense of professional distance. Scientists who had spent decades studying quantum mechanics were leaving their seats, moving closer to see Sarah's drawings. The security team shifted nervously, but Musk waved them back. "Sarah," he said, his voice gentle but urgent, "can you tell me what you see when you look at these patterns? Not what you draw, what you feel." She closed her eyes for a moment, as if listening to something only she could hear. "It's like music, but made of light and numbers. All the numbers that ever were or will be dancing together. They make shapes, and the shapes tell stories, and the stories are about everything." A tear rolled down Musk's cheek, something no one in the tech world had ever seen before. The man who had weathered market crashes, rocket explosions, and public ridicule was crying because of a child's description of mathematical patterns. "That's exactly what our quantum computers have been showing us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But we needed AIs with more computing power than the entire internet to see it. And you just look and know." He stood suddenly, turning to address the audience with the intensity that had made him famous. "Do you understand what this means? We've been approaching consciousness, intelligence, even reality itself from the wrong direction. We've been trying to build our way up to understanding, but what if understanding is already there, waiting for us to remember how to see it?" The lights flickered again, stronger this time. Cell phones in the audience began turning on by themselves, their screens displaying cascading patterns of numbers that matched Sarah's drawings. Several people gasped, holding up their devices. "That's definitely not supposed to happen," Musk said. But he was smiling now, the same smile he wore when a seemingly impossible experiment yielded unexpected results. Sarah had turned to a new page, her hand moving with increasing speed. But now she wasn't just drawing. She was writing equations, complex mathematical formulas that made the quantum physicists in the room exchange startled glances. "Those are solutions," one of them called out. "Solutions to quantum gravity problems we've been working on for decades. How is she?" But before he could finish his question, Sarah looked up from her notebook, her eyes shining with an inner light that made several people step back. What she said next would not only change the course of the conference, but would launch a revolution in how humanity understood its place in the cosmos. "Mr. Musk," Sarah said, her voice carrying a certainty that seemed far beyond her years. I know why your Neuralink experiments aren't working completely. You're looking for consciousness in the brain. But consciousness isn't just in the brain. It's everywhere. It's what everything is made of. The room fell silent. Even the gentle hum of the ventilation system seemed to pause as if the very air was listening. Musk sank back down to her level, all pretense of being the world's richest tech mogul stripped away. In that moment, he was just a seeker facing a truth he had sensed but never been able to grasp. "Show me," he whispered. Sarah turned her notebook so everyone could see. The pattern she had drawn wasn't just a diagram or an equation. It was both and neither. It seemed to shift as you looked at it, revealing different layers of meaning from every angle. "This is us," she said, pointing to one part of the pattern. "Not just our bodies or our brains, but all of us, our thoughts, our feelings, our memories. And this," her finger moved to another section. "This is everything else, but look, they're the same pattern. They've always been the same pattern." Musk's hands were shaking as he pulled out his phone. With a few quick taps, he pulled up a classified image from Neuralink's latest research. He held it next to Sarah's drawing. The patterns were identical. "We've been running quantum scans of neural networks for years," he said, his voice carrying across the stunned audience, "trying to understand how consciousness emerges from neural activity. This pattern appeared 2 days ago in our most advanced test. We thought it was a breakthrough in neural mapping, but now—" "It's a map of everything," Sarah completed his thought. "The universe is thinking through us, Mr. Musk. We're not creating consciousness in your labs. We're finally learning to see it." The implications of what she was saying began to ripple through the audience. Phones were forgotten. Laptops closed. Every eye was fixed on the small girl who had just articulated what billions of dollars in research had been trying to discover. But before anyone could process the full magnitude of this revelation, Sarah had one more thing to share, something that would not only validate everything she had shown them, but would open a door to understanding that humanity had been seeking since it first looked up at the stars and wondered about its place in the cosmos. Sarah's small hand reached out and touched the screen of Musk's phone, right where the Neuralink pattern glowed. At that exact moment, every electronic device in the auditorium lit up simultaneously. Phones, laptops, even the massive display screens behind the stage. Each screen showed the same pattern, pulsing in perfect synchronization. "This is what God is," Sarah said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Not a person, not a thing, but a pattern that connects everything. The numbers I see, the equations, they're just different ways of describing the same truth. We're all part of it, all the time. We just forget how to see it." Musk stood slowly, his eyes never leaving the synchronized displays. The man who had revolutionized electric cars, space travel, and neural interfaces looked like he had just witnessed something that transcended all his technological achievements. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a new kind of certainty, "I want to make you an offer. Not just access to our labs, but something more important. I want to create a new division at Neuralink, one that bridges the gap between what our machines can measure and what minds like yours can see." He turned to address the audience, but his words were really for everyone who would eventually hear this story. "We've been approaching consciousness like engineers, trying to build it from the ground up. But Sarah has shown us that consciousness isn't something to build, it's something to recognize. It's the fundamental pattern of reality itself." The announcement he made next would reshape the future of human understanding. Within months, the Sarah Chen Initiative would become the most talked-about research project in history, bringing together quantum physicists, neuroscientists, mathematicians, and children like Sarah who could see the patterns. But, perhaps more importantly, it would spark a global conversation about the nature of consciousness, reality, and what people had been calling God for millennia. The pattern Sarah saw, the one that quantum computers had begun to detect, would be found everywhere, in the structure of galaxies, in the dance of subatomic particles, in the firing of neural networks, and in the mathematical constants that governed it all. As Sarah left the auditorium that day, holding her mother's hand and clutching her notebook of universe-changing patterns, She looked back at Musk one last time. "Thank you for seeing it too," she said simply. Musk nodded, understanding that he had just witnessed something that went beyond all his technological achievements, a glimpse of the pattern that connected everything, revealed through the pure perception of a child who wasn't afraid to ask the biggest question of all. And in research labs and observatories around the world, scientists were about to discover that the pattern Sarah had drawn in her notebook was just the beginning of a much larger revelation about the true nature of reality itself. If you're as moved as we are by this unexpected connection between a brilliant child and one of the world's greatest innovators, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel.